was just starting to give a 1 minute, 2 minute brief ritual account of the history of the Friday morning seminar. Leon Eisenberg in 1980 was asked by a dean named Jim Adelstein to create a new department of social medicine and health policy. His first recruit was Arthur Kleinman, who came from the psychiatry department at University of Washington, returned to Harvard, where he had been.
Hi there, Sadek.
Hi there,
Can you
Mary
hear
Jo.
me?
Yep,
Yes, hi, Mary Jo. We hear you very well. Yeah,
My video is not working, so
Okay.
but your audio comes through very well.
I can't hear anything either.
So in 1983, Arthur and Leon invited Mary Jo and me to come from the University of California, Davis, and the Department of Psychiatry, where we were. And the first thing Arthur asked us to do was to write a draft of a training grant that would hire predoctoral and postdoctoral fellows in the behavioral sciences division of the National Institute of Mental Health. That went through a second round, and in 1984 was funded and remained funded for 24 years, bringing some bringing something like 50 or 60 postdoctoral fellows and supporting something like 40 or 50 graduate students working broadly in medical anthropology, in culture and mental health services. That grant continued for 24 years, after which we've kept the seminar going with the support of individual donors and of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. From about 1987 until COVID began, this was held every Friday morning on the 15th floor of William James Hall, of course, in person. And only with COVID did we take this seminar to Zoom. And what it's done is allowed us to really bring together the people we're looking at here, the community that's gathered here from really all over the world. And it's been a great kind of liberation from space and time to actually not be, though we miss seeing each other on the 15th floor and looking out over Boston from that setting, we're so delighted that we can do this seminar and do it here and see you all on such a regular basis. So we had intended to launch the seminar with Sadek talking narrowly, I think, or explicitly about his new book called The Hauntology of Everyday Life, which is published about a year ago, and in which I have a preface to, and Mike Fischer has written a concluding statement for. But I know that given what's happening in Iran, haunting has a very real sense for Sadek about his own relationship to the past and to the present of Iran, and I know he wants to talk about that today as a central part of the introduction to this seminar. A word, many of you know Sadek as the organizer, the coordinator of this seminar, and one of those of us who have been helping organize this seminar for over the years. But it's worth saying a few more words about him and why it's so appropriate that he launched this seminar. Sadek has his doctoral degree in what was called cultural psychiatry from McGill, where he worked with some persons who join us often here.
Ellen is here.
Is Ellen here? My
Yeah,
God.
I just saw
Ellen, my
Ellen
God, welcome. and Jaswant is here, and
Right.
so some of Sadek's old teachers and mentors from there. But Sadek also started. I'll just say a word, Sadek. So Sadek left as a political refugee from Iran as an undergraduate student. Spent years in transition as a political refugee in Turkey, and then was welcomed by the Canadian government to Montreal or to Canada, and where he ended up going on and doing his work, his advanced work in cultural psychiatry. As I've said, he did his first research on schizophrenia in Turkey, and from that came this book, which is Meaning, Madness, and Political Subjectivity, a study of schizophrenia and culture in Turkey. When one thinks of studying subjectivity, or whether one thinks of studying schizophrenia in another society, one seldom thinks of doing those two together. And one of the remarkable things is Sadek's really showing us in what ways persons with schizophrenia are political subjects all the way down. That it is part of that persons with schizophrenia remain active, struggling often subjects, and subjects that are political all the way down. And so we're going to welcome Sadek to kick off this year's seminar with his conversation. We are joined, I want to say, and I'll introduce her more later, by Orkide Behruzan, who is at SOAS and the head of the medical anthropology program in SOAS, and who has written a really brilliant book about Iran, and she will join us in conversation. Michael Fischer, another organizer of the seminar, who spent many years working in Iran and has written actively about several books about Iran, will be joining in as a commentator. Mary Jo and I, who worked in Iran, will make some comments at the end also. But I think with that, I'll take no more time and ask Sadek to lead us through our initial seminar. Welcome to everyone.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much, Byron. Thank you. So Byron, please just keep an eye on people coming in, so I won't be able to worry about them. Hello, everybody. So wonderful to see so many people here. I'm not going to go through that, and I'm going to go straight to what I'm planning to talk to today. But just very quickly, like Byron said, I was originally planning to focus, this was what the session was to be, on Hauntology, on my book, and so on. But what is happening, in addition to my background and so on, what is happening right now in Iran is just too powerful, too strong, and in a positive way, simultaneously, obviously negative, but for me, it's also extremely positive and life-giving. I guess that's my experience of it. And I'll come back to that towards the end a little bit. And, seeing so many of Iranians, my friends, my family, my patients, my students in Iran, they're just, getting shot, getting killed for nothing, no reason. And it would be impossible to not spend a good time, trying to talk about that. It would be just wrong. So hopefully it's okay. So what that means, though, what I'm going to present is going to be kind of bridging a couple of different discussions together. Hopefully it makes some sense, though. It is a sense that is emerging for me, and I think they're very related. But then I look forward to your thoughts and feedbacks, including on that, whether these ideas come together or in what way these ideas come together. So let me start then with Huntology. So I'm going to talk about Huntology a little bit as an introductory, kind of setting it up for this session. Those of you who have been with this seminar for a while, I'm going to read. I've certainly heard us talk about hauntology many times. We have held seminars and panels and publications about the idea. And so I don't want to revisit all the things that we have already covered here. Instead, I will try to offer a quick overview of the core argument of the book, namely the idea that hauntology is not an exotic notion, that it is neither an artifact of high theory nor a language designed for speaking of overwhelming events of historic proportion, whether collectively or individually, war, genocide, murder, and so on. It is, as the title of the book has it, a matter of everyday life. So part of what I will try to do is to outline the way the very process of making sense of, I won't try it here, but in the book, that's what I mean. The very process of making sense of the world, in other words, the process of the infant growing to become a social subject, a part of the order of things, such as language and other symbolic systems, law and social relationships, and so on. These very processes are the processes that create a hauntological condition. That is to say, a condition of things, objects, ideas, words, and experiences being haunted by something else, which is not openly and clearly present in those words, ideas, objects, or experiences, and constantly wants to come back. This, to me, is the fundamental hauntological process, which then leads to and makes us vulnerable to or liable to all sorts of experiences and subjective states, which we associate with the notion of being haunted. From the haunting beauty of a poem or an abandoned building to the metaphoric uses of haunting, to social and political processes where an entire society is haunted by an event or a historic period, to people being literally haunted by ghosts and looking for exorcists. All of these we are capable of, or should I say we are susceptible of experiencing, because of the fundamental hauntogenic mechanisms of production of meaning, and hence production of the human sense of self and identity and social relations, or in short, subjectivity. So this is the main take-home message of the book, of the Hauntology of Everyday Life. In order to argue for hauntology as the appropriate language for speaking of basic human experiences, that's what I wrote there, one may think of a few layers of significance. At the very core of these so-called layers would be meaning and its formation, which is so closely entangled with the formation of desire as to be considered one and the same. This core duo sets the foundation of the range of human subjective experiences, including thought, speech, textuality, and temporality, along with drives, affects, power, and politicality. The ensemble of these effects translate in turn into what we identify as the domain of ontology and its subsidiary epistemology. Simply put, the call to hauntological thinking entails the call to a fundamentally different mode of understanding the human subject as opposed to ontological understanding. Hauntology does not ask to be or not to be. It claims instead the simultaneous playfulness of to be and not to be. Hauntology is always subjunctive, to go back to Byron and Mary Jo Good's early discovery of the subjunctive world in Iran. Hauntology may be understood as an act of reading informed by the fact that the world is the death of the thing, as Hegel emphasized. The word, I meant to say the word is the death of the thing. I don't know, maybe I said the world. The word comes to be only after the death of the thing, yet it is not the death of the thing that renders the word meaningful. The word is a word only insofar as it is haunted by the spectral presence of the dead thing. If the word is haunted, then the act of reading can take two basic postures: towards the text or the subject, as hauntology or as exorcism. There are, of course, different modalities of exorcism, as in one that seeks to extract and conjure away the ghost that is deemed destructive, polluting, pathogenic, or in any case, unwanted. And then another that seeks to liberate, to vindicate, to revive, or in any case, to help the ghost leave the confinements of a haunted place, haunted person, or society, or text. But whether sympathetic or antithetical, while a hauntological reading would strive to admit the presence of the ghost and seeks to unearth and unpack to the extent possible a text's or a subject's layers and dynamics of spectral presences, an exorcism, whether benign or aggressively postured, intends and attempts to separate, to identify, to recover, and to release one or the other, the haunted or the haunter, by extracting and naming the ghost that haunts. When hauntological reading is performed successfully, it manages to animate a text or a subject through an outpouring of ghosts from the otherwise silent depths of the text or the psyche. In Derrida's words, the goal is to learn how to, quote, let them, ghosts, speak, or how to give them back speech, even if it is in oneself. When exorcism is successful, on the other hand, the specter is separated, forcefully again or peacefully, from the body or the ward that it has been haunting, and it is banished or released, either to go away or to reclaim its presumed rightful position of narrative power. In either case, however, to cease haunting and to stop existing as a ghost. We can consider ourselves fortunate then that no act of exorcism can ever be completely successful. Exorcisms, regardless of their avowed intention and despite their most sincere emancipatory agendas, always aspire to establish a specific order of power meaning. And they seek to put an end to the fact that the text or subject is never complete and always errant. The logic of hauntology serves and yet subverts both these agendas. The logic of hauntology belies any established order of power meaning insofar as it recognizes as haunted, and hence always as duplicitous, the very essence of reality, and perhaps more importantly, insofar as it simultaneously defies the most foundational tenets of both nostalgic and messianic utopianism. Above all else, ontology has a promise of its own, a promise deeply political and deeply concerned with the notion of justice, yet elusively free from any political allegiance or moral point of reference, beyond the subversively simple idea of acknowledging the presence of the absence and hearing the voices of the silenced. But what could possibly be more impactful, politically impactful, than to understand and unpack the present for what it is and for all that it is, in order to select strategic social or political lines of move, or to design effective interventions? We need to first understand the possibilities, hopes, and desires that were once and are no longer available to the public conscious, or to unearth and exhume crypts in which suppressed dreams of past communities and their lost moments are trapped. This is clearly a different strategy from history, from archaeology, and even from a Foucauldian genealogy, in that instead of attempting to establish that which was, hauntological analysis seeks to know, to allow to speak, to be more specific, that which was to be, that which could have been but never was, the future that hailed the past, but then disappeared from the horizon. So, the ubiquity with which the ontogenic process appears to be at work across these diverse developmental paths to human subjectivity is the single most convincing argument for and evidence of the need for a coherent ontological theory of subjectivity and subjective experience. A ontology of everyday life is not meant to exercise the everyday life or to heal it, nor does it pursue a specific political order or have in mind an attainable and defined formulation for justice or emancipation. As a matter of fact, Huntology upsets the political order and the normative notion of justice as an end attainable through law. Just as the ghost, quote, upsets all calculations, interests, and capital, Huntology upsets the order of things and subverts the very regime of truth within which justice may have been sought and defined. By driving home the simple fact that any dominant discourse and any regime of truth, in order to be a dominant discourse or to become the regime of truth, has to establish a systemic repression of other meanings, ontology becomes a de facto revolutionary theory, but not a revolution seeking to replace a dominant order with another. It becomes a theory of eternal revolution, if you like, since every meaning, every order, and every representation is haunted by that which it has failed or refused to represent, that which is not meant, and which is therefore a potential victim in need of a voice and a potential contender for a regime of its own. Justice, in this sense, then, belongs to the order of the imaginary, which is also to say that justice resides outside the law. Justice can only be approached, but never reached, as a form of liberation of that which has never been, yet it has been suppressed and yet has survived the suppression, and its ghostly presence haunts the law of the land. By cracking open the law, the language, the regimes of truth, justice emerges as an expression of lost voices. Just like language, or any symbolic structures for that matter, law has ghosts trapped in it. There is, in every system of law, to quote Derrida here, quote, a silence walled up in the violent structure of the founding act. Walled up, walled in, because the silence is not exterior to language. This is precisely what brought Italo Calvino, for example, to insist, quoting Calvino, the more enlightened our houses are, the more their walls ooze ghosts. Dreams of progress and reason are haunted by nightmares, end quote. So ontology does not seek to exorcise, extract, expel, or heal the ghosts of everyday life, and nor does it promise a utopian justice. Yet once we awake to the spectral nature of such notions as healing or justice, it becomes impossible to imagine any effective action towards either, meaning either of those, without a deep understanding of the ontological nature of truth. And more importantly, without roadmaps for healing and for justice that lead to nowhere. So here I was originally planning to get into a more detailed discussion of ontological justice and all that, and what it means and how it relates to real life. But let me make a slight turn instead and take a look at the Iranian situation, not the current one. I'll come back to that a little bit later. The Iranian situation that in the last century or two, it has shown every indication of a traumatized society haunted by some unspeakable dreams and stuck in a kind of eternal cycle of the return of the same that psychoanalysis has taught us to typically identify with trauma and post-traumatic repetitions. In his book, The Ghosts of My Life, the late Mark Fischer, celebrated for his brilliant work on hauntology, opens a political analysis of the 21st century with a reminiscence of the 1980s fantasy TV series, British, Sapphire and Steel, as he moves to portray the 21st century capitalist culture, European, North America, as stuck in the quicksand of nostalgia, as one of his reviewers put it, circling around the edge of a timeless hole at the center of a cultural whirlpool, haunted by a future that never came, a culture finding itself replete with stagnant retrofixation on reproductions of old trends and patterns. Time is dislocated and memory's needle continuously skips. As themes repeat themselves, hardly altered styles get reintroduced under new names, and so on. Old melodies are recycled ad nauseum in the name of new content, and yet nobody seems to feel any nausea. Nobody perceives the repetition as redundant, as this is the psychology of trauma teaches us, the subjective state of the traumatized psyche stuck in cycles of repetition. Years before Mark Fischer and years before Sapphire and Steel, while the capitalist world was still deeply immersed in a glorious dream anticipation of the endless progress to come, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was working on a different trauma-born state of endless repetition in his timeless story, 100 Years of Solitude. Actually, 100 years of trauma, as one of my students put it very aptly, where the village of Macondo is suspended in a magical reality where disasters, errors, and self-destructive patterns have a perpetual habit of repeating themselves, or better put, where people have a perpetual habit of repeating patterns of behavior and decisions that lead to the same set of disasters, losses, and self-destructive results, again and again. The same characters come back generation after generation, and while the story moves through these generations, time seems to move in circles. People make the same plans. Civil wars and firing squads keep echoing each other. Characters are apparently unable to escape the circular trap of their history. As it may be somewhat clear by now, the key word that seems to bring these two otherwise distinct accounts of haunted societies stuck in some form of temporal circularity is the term trauma. For Mark Fisher's capitalist West, it is the traumatic, I'm quoting, the traumatic dimensions of social transformation, as he put it. And for Marquez, it is the trauma of colonization and its socio-political aftermath. And let us not forget, both these are built around utopian and nostalgic models. Europe, Western Europe in any case, spent the good portion of the 20th century dreaming of a utopia to come, specifically with the rapid and linear progression of technology, culture, and economy, while the masses in Eastern Europe struggled to deal with and to survive the socialist utopia. And at that same time, Latin America, like many other places around the globe, repeatedly lived and relived the unsettling pains of the colonial memory as they sought to find themselves various forms of utopia, built either around glorified narratives of a past unjustly killed off by Europeans, or unpromising narratives of beautiful futures of equity and peace. Without the luxury of entering into a detailed discussion of the technicalities from psychoanalytic point of view on trauma and its vicissitudes, I would like to point out a high-level distinction between two senses of trauma. One is an existential trauma, namely a trauma that is associated with the very process of coming to exist as individual consciousness, this trauma is fundamentally generative. That is to say, it is in response to this trauma, or in any case, in the process of the unfolding of this traumatic event, that self-consciousness emerges and takes shape. And the human infant is separated from the mother. Here I am speaking, sorry, just one second. Here I am speaking of the very originary separation that culminates in the event of birth and then gets completed through the development of ego and acquisition of language and so on. The second kind of trauma, the second type of trauma, is the sense of the word which is more familiar in the daily clinical and academic use of the term. That is, to use American Psychological Association's definition, an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. And of course, this is also translated then into collective or historical trauma, which, as you know, is understood as a psychological reaction to traumatic events that affect an entire society. I'm highlighting this distinction because the distinction between these two sets of traumas, it kind of highlights the distinction between another set of words that I use to fall back on, namely the nostalgic and the utopian functions, versus nostalgianism, if you like to call it, and utopianism. Nostalgic and utopian functions are foundational forces that drive human psychic apparatus, and they give rise to basic vectors within cultural systems. Psychoanalytically speaking, these two functions are what human psychic apparatus employs to cope with the existential trouble that is the side effect of being born into this world and becoming a self-aware social subject. Let's just say for now that these two functions or forces, one of which points to and pushes towards the future as the site of regaining existential fullness, which is the messianic utopian function, while the other points to and flows towards the past as the site of fulfillment and reunion with the lost object, as it's called in psychoanalytic jargon. Now, this formulation can also be read as an attempt to avoid the painful present, insofar as the present moment, the pure present moment, is nothing but the emptiness that represents precisely that loss, the object that is not there. In this sense, nostalgia and utopian messianism are both fundamentally the manifestations of a single fact. That is to say, they are expressions of an internally experienced need for leaving the present, which is experienced as painfully incomplete and unbearable, in the desire of arriving at or returning to an imaginary place of peace, fullness, and serenity. Among the various effects of these two forces within the psychic life are the dynamics of meaning and desire. Again, I'm not going to touch any of these here, but the point is that these two forces, nostalgic and utopian, messianic, should be understood as two perfectly normal and natural components of the psychic system that interact with one another on the one hand, and with the cognitive and affective content of the mind, and later with social environment, to give shape to our subjective processing of our senses and our lived reality. Now, on the other hand, messianic utopianism and nostalgianism are not simple manifestations of these two functions. Nostalgianism and utopianism can be understood in some sense as perversions of these otherwise normal psychic processes. They appear as signs of strong dissatisfaction with the present moment. This point, by the way, is very much common in literature, in social science literature and political science literature on utopian and nostalgic political ideologies and movements, and typically in post-traumatic societies. In other words, They arise most prominently under social and political conditions where senses of hopelessness, fear, and general frustration with the present are predominant moods. In simple words, you can think of them as the states of mind where A, one of the basic functions, nostalgic or messianic, utopian, has consolidated into the dominant affective and cognitive driver of a meta-narrative, and B, the basic logical outcome of that argument has been then crystallized into a core assumption, as in a messianic core or a nostalgic core, and around which a comprehensive system of logical arguments and conclusions has emerged to form an ideological narrative that serves as the cognitive basis of behavioral decision-making and affective interpretation of the environment. Whereas utopian and nostalgic functions are flexible and in constant play with each other to create the nuances of our subjective experience, utopianism and nostalgianism are neither flexible nor capable of playful interaction with each other. As a matter of fact, at their peak, they crystallize into totalizing closed systems with little or no room for or tolerance of alternative social and political narratives. If your narrative says forward is right, for example, if you're convinced new ideas, modernization, westernization is the way to your future salvation, then backward, i.e., anything that has to do with the past and everything associated with that becomes intolerable and needs to be rejected in its totality. And if your narrative dictates the way backwards is right, if you're seeking a lost imaginary ethnic or national purity or the original pure spirit of your religion and so on, then anything that tells you otherwise by pushing forward or introducing impurities into the pure state that you are fantasizing, that becomes intolerable and evil and needs to be eliminated or at the very least silenced. Once these basic, otherwise normal functions are petrified into literal ideological forms as means of psychological escape from an undesirable socio-political present in a post-traumatic, specifically, context, they become prescriptive dictums, acquiring a strictly paranoid schizoid worldview, to borrow from Melanie Klein, one that divides the world into black and white, squares of good and evil, with no shades of gray. This is a very modern phenomenon, I want to add, strongly supported and fortified by modernist accounts that emerged from Enlightenment. Ironically enough, this kind of discourse can be past-oriented, passionately and strongly defining itself in contradistinction to modernity and to its expressions, and yet still built on the modernist logic. The Iranian Islamic Revolution was a great example of this fundamental paradox. While the Iranian Constitutional Revolution in 1906 was driven by a future-oriented utopianism and more or less explicitly seeking to internalize a European logic, the Islamic Revolution of 1997 was built around a nostalgic ideology whose core logic was very much built on a modernist understanding of the world, even though it explicitly sought to displace modernity with an imaginary, pure Mohammedan Islam, Islam and Nab Muhammadi, as Khomeini used to say very regularly, that supposedly existed over 14 centuries ago. So within the last century or so, the Iranian society, traumatized by its steep decline into poverty, illiteracy, and political insignificance, especially against colonial forces and later against global superpowers, has found itself repeatedly circling a seemingly closed cycle of attempted breaks from ongoing self-destructive patterns of violence, corruption, and despotism each time only to find itself back where it had started. Common across these repeating attempts seems to be a desperate desire for a promised fullness, a desire expressed in alternately messianic, utopian, and nostalgic utopian terms. One regime violates the nation in its effort to bring them to the total utopia of the great civilization, as the Shah used to put it, darvazahai tamaddun buzurg. It is toppled and replaced by another that violates the nation in its attempt at bringing the pure Muhammadan Islam, again, Islam Nab Muhammadi, followed perhaps by yet another regime promising a new sublime state of happiness and prosperity. And what has continued to go unnoticed in these successions of futuristic and nostalgic failures is the fact that regardless of the name of the fantasized golden state or its direction in time, the traumatic experience is never recognized and identified for what it is. And the desire it continues to generate is almost always formulated in a discourse that can only speak the logic of either or, not both and. That is, a regressive ideological state of paranoid, schizoid, psychic processing, repeatedly creating closed systems based on the discourse of a final destination that offers the fullness of absolute satisfaction and emancipation. And that fullness is precisely where the circle closes in on itself. Now, so this is the last part. Now, think of the fact that in the midst of this impressively boring, recursive story, we suddenly get the current movement, what's happening right now on the streets in Iran. A movement, so I'm not going to get into the details of this movement and so on. We have a great set of panelists here, and that will come out. But this is a movement that has not even found a name yet, right? It's been around for a couple of weeks. What makes me really excited, what has given me something of a new life within the last 2 weeks or so, since September 16 to be exact, is that somehow the ground seems to have broken in Iran and something new has burst out. Something that feels, and I'm saying feels because it's just too early to have to abstract it and have to speak in any confidently about what it is. But it feels quite different. Something fundamentally different from what we have seen in Iran over the couple of centuries that I have been speaking to. Something that is not about a nostalgic ideology of return, nor about some form of messianic justice, but about this very living moment. In fact, the living thing really goes to the core of this thing that is happening in Iran for me. Its core slogan, for example, woman, life, freedom, zan, zendagi, azadi, also reflects that. And this living quality, which seems to have burst out of a different dimension to cut right through the routine and the redundant narratives of justice and progress and political liberation. I don't want to take much longer, especially since we have a few people, like I said, who are wonderful experts on Iran, and I really look forward to hearing their thoughts. But let me just address one aspect of this current event before I stop, namely the hair cutting ritual, the notion of hair, the symbolism of hair, and the hair cutting ritual. Of course, the symbolism of hair is very prevalent because this is in many ways about hijab. It started around hijab. The girl that got killed, Mahsa, on September 16, I believe it was September, I hope I'm not putting the wrong date here, was, it's been on the news, so I don't want to go over it, but so the movement in some sense is predominantly about covering women's hair or not, right? One gesture that has become a sign of protest against the death of Mahsa is hair cutting. Almost like one of those TikTok challenges, women and men pick up a pair of scissors and cut their hair on camera and post it to social media. Of course, this is an old ritualistic gesture and an indication of mourning and grief, especially once in protest to unjust death, where the person, traditionally women, cut their hair as they mourn. You find this practice in old Middle Eastern texts, all the way as the Epic of Gilgamesh, but you also find it in Greek literature, classical Greek literature. Symbolically speaking, hair is an extremely loaded metaphor in Persian literature, typically associated with life, with water, with beauty, with movement, and above all, with rebirth. Gilgamesh warns his old friend, or his double, in some accounts, Enkidu, by announcing that he shall cut his hair after Enkidu dies, and adding that once you are buried deep in earth, my hair shall grow again. Same thing in Sappho, the Greek poet Sappho of Lesbos, as she mourns her intimate student / lover, Timas. Timas, by the way, means precious. So in both these cases, I just want to point out there's something extremely important and precious about what is gone. She says, to cut in mourning for her these curls of our soft hair. And she makes specific reference to Timas being taken to the chambers of Persephone. This is very erotic. This is very libidinal. Persephone is, of course, the goddess of simultaneously associated with death and shadows going into the underworld, but also with rebirth and regrowth. In other words, with Eros and with Thanatos at the same time, with the cycle of life as such. And remember, this is the cycle of life that you want to see in a society to follow. This is the healthy cycle of life. This is the healthy alternative to the frozen cycle of trauma. Again, I don't intend to enter into too much details or analysis, but the point I'd like to make is that the cutting of the hair, which has become the emblem of this movement, has the amazingly powerful symbolism that this is not just about mourning and anger and frustration, but it's about rebirth. It's also about rebirth. It's a way of saying, I am not going to simply lose you and say goodbye. I am going to fully mourn you, and I am going to let you go so that you regrow as a part of me. And those of you who are familiar with Freud's elaborate analysis of mourning and of successful mourning as a process of recreating the lost object may recognize in what I just said this kind of significant logic of the hair cutting. And the reason I zoomed in on this is that it goes to the root of what I said is surprisingly fresh in this current movement, namely that it is about a new burst of life in the face of death and darkness. And more importantly, that it cuts through the redundant circularity of political movements that Iran has experienced in the last couple of centuries. It cuts, in other words, through the redundant logic of trauma that has haunted the Iranian political culture for a long time. And it has already introduced a great and very successful crack in that lifeless discourse. It has brought some incredibly fresh life force to the surface that, to be honest, I did not expect to see, and I am so excited to witness. I'm going to stop at this. Thank you all.
Well, that was both very powerful and extremely stimulating. Thank you, Sadek. And for those of you who are, for all of us seeing this on Zoom, we cannot actually see clearly what in our classes together we can see, which is Sadek's cut hair himself. As our first discussant, or really not just a discussant, but as a participant in this conversation, we're so delighted to have Orkide Behruzan join us today for this conversation, and in particular for a conversation about Iran. Orkide, as I said, is no newcomer to this group of people, having spent years in Cambridge, having worked with Mike Fischer over these years, and having been a part of our community, is now professor and the leader of and creator of a program in medical anthropology at SOAS. Her book, Proessor, Psychiatry and Generational Memory in Iran, even just by title, that is the focus on generational memory in Iran, suggests simply the power of haunting as being present directly in all that she writes about. And much of that book has wonderful material on people who are today haunted by the Iran war in Iraq and by the memories of their childhood. And of course, Sadek talks about trauma and traumatic events. They are numerous and have very powerful histories within Iran. But with that, let me just say no more, but to ask Orkide to join us in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Byron, for having me, and thank you, Sadek. You have no idea how much I needed to hear all of this. Having gone through the past almost 2 weeks, when Byron emailed me to tell me, I can actually be part of this conversation, I actually wrote back and said, I don't really have anything substantial to say, but just being in this conversation is very therapeutic for myself. So thank you for that. I just want to start with some thoughts. My thoughts are not very thought through. I'm going to just share with you some most in the past that has come out and is related to what Sadek so beautifully told us. Byron mentioned my book. I mean, I keep thinking, I wish I had this language to tell that story. I wish I had Sadek's language to tell that story. I really like this starting point with the stuckness in cycles of trauma that Sadek talked about and the repetitions. Because one of the things that's happening right now is, again, it's too soon and we're too close to it. I mean, these are just speculations. One of the things that is happening is that for the first time, there is a space for expressing an anger that so far before this has been always turned inward, and that turned inward anger is now on the streets, but it's not for revenge. It's not angry. It's being expressed, in a way for building, for making, for building a future, for possibilities. And I think that's something that is really hard to articulate, but I really feel it when you hear the words of these people on the streets. When you look at debates on Twitter, when you look at how a lot of infighting has stopped and people are talking about a possible future, I think that's what I think. I think it's a possibility, a possibility for repair. So I like to think of this anger, this rage, as having moved from the past revolutions wanting to take revenge to wanting to repair all of those traumas. And now there's a lot of speculation also about this young generation on the streets. And in a nutshell, these are the children of the generation that I wrote about, basically. These are the next generation. And one of the things that's really astonishing about them is that they have their experience of growing up. First of all, their parents have lived through that, have lived in their bodies to the marrow, have lived fear in their childhood and in their adolescence. And these kids have been very intentionally and explicitly removed from fearful situations, in the sense that they have a voice, they have confidence, they grew up with the internet, they grew up with smartphones. And I think that one of the things that a lot of people are also talking about is how they have their families on their side. They have their parents' generations on their side, which is something the previous generation didn't have. So it's as if the regime and grown-ups were all on one side, and the children of that time on another side. Whereas now those family structures have changed. There was something about this amazing analysis that Sadek had about trauma, and how, I keep thinking about the endless list of thwith that are demanded in this movement, but are extremely trivial. There is a campaign going on Twitter with tweets that start with the word for, or for the sake of, baroye. And, this fight is for my uncle who was executed, for my brother who went to the war, for my hair that never felt the wind, that kind of thing. A lot is coming out. And someone actually tweeted, and it became very viral, and said, for the endless list of wars that this fight is for. And the thing about the traumas that are implicit in this list is that you cannot locate the event. There is no event. No one can say where. I don't know. I'm trying to think of how, as a condition of trauma, an experience of trauma that cannot be located in an event, can turn from a psychological trauma to an existential trauma. Is it possible to think of this it gets to a point that it becomes an existential condition instead of just a psychological trauma? The moment that this movement started is also really worth thinking about, because this was the first time that a lot of movements in Iran and in the Middle East have been sparked by a brutal death. But this is the first time that, for Iranians at least, that they turned death, murder to be more precise, they turned it into life, because it wasn't about mourning as much as it was about the present moment. From day one, people were talking about, for the life of Mahsa, not for the mourning process was about, we are on the streets for Mahsa because we are all Mahsa. And I think there is something very life rich in it, that is sort of removing itself from death. The other campaign that has been going around for a long time, now before this movement, is a campaign of Zindagi Mamuli. People talk about fighting for a normal life, the trivial, things that they are demanding. Normal life, being able to wear what I want to wear, being able to go sit in a restaurant without a hijab, or being able to, have a job. And the narratives of these, the fours and the normal lives, go back to the past, but bring the past into the present moment. And as Sadek so beautifully said, that the movement is future oriented, it feels, but at the same time, it's extremely mindful. That makes sense. It's extremely grounded in the present moment. And I think this is something that the Iranian society is not used to, if I'm honest. I'm going to share with you something I wrote down yesterday because I was thinking about today, and I was playing with the word Huntology in my head, and I just wrote like in the margin of my notebook. I wrote something that I think was very much a description of how I was feeling about the movement. It reads, I'm sitting here haunted by the past, but in a new way, by pain and terror, by the terror of hope, the possibility of articulating silence, of talking silence, of bringing silence to life. A haunted articulation of everything that was killed, everything that was silenced, past and present. And the reason why I'm sharing that is there is something about the possibility that Ontology is giving us, the tool that it is giving us to sort of formulate this future-oriented, present-oriented, and future-oriented nature of this moment, especially for this generation that they're called the #HA, it's like the millennials in a way. The one thing that I also wanted to say about the haunting, you said something very powerful. You said something about the simultaneous playfulness of being and not being, and that's extremely compelling. But that's also what is compelling about this very ontological condition, in a sense that when I look at these images and when this movement started, I grew up here in Iran. I have worn those scarves. I have gone to school in those clothes, and and like millions of others. But I noticed something new, which is, as an anthropologist of Iran, we all struggle with this, where am I standing in this story? And my place keeps shifting. Cognitively, it was resonating. I'm trying to understand what is happening. Effectively, it's affecting me. I haven't really slept in 10 days. And when I'm awake, I'm not fully awake. But there's also something bodily, very visceral, very, in my skin. And I'm so glad Sadegh mentioned hair, because it's the body is now feeling the beating. Every time they beat someone, I feel it. I haven't been beaten, but I feel it. And I don't know how to explain that. But with the hairs, the cutting of hair has been something that the first 2 days when it happened, I actually didn't know what to think about it, because I was like, well, I wasn't sure if it was helpful. And then it started to become a collective act outside of Iran. And when people did it together, and with these big scissors, one thing that was extremely haunting for me was the sound it makes, the noise it makes, because imagine a blunt edge, and it's like, and I really paused. And I think there is, I don't have the capacity right now to theorize anything or to formulate anything, but I just want to share the shifts that are being made in the way experience is coming into conversations, coming into articulation, and a lot of articulation of silence is happening. And this articulation of silence, as Sadegh so beautifully explained, is not looking back. It's not retrospective. It's looking forward. It's silence being articulated for a normal life, for being just having this metaphor of wind in your hair is extremely extremely common among Iranians. And I think there is one background to this, that before the movement started, as you know, it's a few years now that the movement of Dokhtaran Engelab started, where one brave young woman went out in public, took off her scarf and put it on top of a stick, and became a symbol of the, they're called the girls of the Revolution Street, and that street is called the Revolution, Engelab. A number of people followed it. It became a campaign, and a lot of people also were arrested as a result. So the concept of taking off the scarf and putting on a stick was there. But in this movement, for the first time, we saw that people are burning the scarf. It wasn't enough to put it on a stick or taking it off. It was the burning. And I think the burning, again, for me, was very visceral. You know, there is this sense that, you know, I keep looking back at the notes that I had written something about that movement, this movement, the taking off the scarf movement. And I looked at my notes, and I found something that I wrote last summer, and I'm writing, this is such a cliche, I keep coming back to this. I'm walking on Prince Albert Road, it's summer, I'm coming back from the pub, and I'm wearing a strap dress. I don't know how, strap dress. And what a cliche, because again, I thought of the girls of the Revolution Street. And again, I thought happiness is this moment. Happiness is freedom. How repetitive, what a cliche. And I kept thinking about this, how trivial this demand had become. 15 years ago, if you talked about hijab, a lot of people, since the revolution, all the way to 10, 15 years ago, a lot of people, the majority of people would be like, well, it's just a piece of cloth. We have more important issues to deal with. And this is what happened with the revolution. This is why the women's movement didn't succeed in resisting the compulsory hijab. And now those people, including the parents who said that, are not thinking of it as a piece of cloth. And again, just one last note about the mundaneness, the everydayness of these demands, of the realness of it. Now you see people saying, a lot of the religious people or the regime people say, well, these kids are on the street, they don't have any Arman, they don't have any ideals, they're on the streets because they just want to become naked and drink and get drunk. And their response, yes, exactly, we are fighting for the possibility of getting drunk and being naked. And I think this, now what do we want to do? This is exactly what we want. So the idea that this generation was looked down on as a generation, without any ideals, without any beliefs, is also turned upside down, and they've kind of owned it, and they're insisting that it's exactly the fact that we don't have an elevated ideology leading us, exactly the fact that, as Sadegh said, justice is about the possibility. This is about the possibility of justice. This moment is characterized by the possibility of justice, not a certain ideology, not a certain end goal. And I wonder, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because I actually stopped there because I don't know how to think further. And I apologize if this was really scattered, because I think I'm right now not prepared to really think about this very carefully, too close, and it's too fresh. But thank you for letting me be here, and thank you, Sadegh, so much.
Well, thank you, Orchidea. Thank you very much. And for those of you who are so much in the midst of this, it's very powerful to hear you talk about it. Sadegh, do you want to respond before we ask Michael?
Sure, yeah, a very quick one anyway. Just first of all, to say how happy I am that you were able to join us, Orchidea. Really, it just means so much. And what you put on the table for us, I think, is just really captures so much. There's so much that I see and identify in what you're saying, that as so you say it's, you apologize that it's scattered or that it's not. it's nobody has that. It's just happening right now. It's flowing out, and it's coming from somewhere so deep, the whole thing, not just in me and you, that, there is no words for it. And I think that's the whole thing. That's the freshness. That's life. Life is before words, words is the death of life. Remember that? So that's how it is. That's it. And that's precisely why it's being so successful. And when I say successful, it doesn't mean it's going to be a revolution. I'm not saying the Islamic Republic is going to be toppled. I really doubt that's going to happen. I hope it does, but I really doubt it will. But that crack that I was talking about, it just has opened a crack right there that now nobody can close it anymore. And that's it. Once you introduce that crack to this, abstract system, whatever you want to call it, then that's it. Then the rest is history, so to speak. This is going to continue. There's an Iranian patient that I work with from Iran through Zoom. Luckily, they've been shutting all the internet, but Zoom has been spared for some reason. I think they just don't think it has much political utility. So I've continued to be able to work with her. And last week, just a few days after this stuff, she was just so elated and comes in and bursts into talking about all these things going right in her life, and no reference to any of this, just talking in a way that's so different from the way she has been in all the past months that we've been working together. And then only towards the end, she starts kind of moving into talking about these. And then I kind of pointed out, and she said, wow, you're right. Anyway, so without even ever thinking about it, it just has shifted just the way she feels in this world. And that's what you're talking about. And it's bodily. It's I don't want to say erotic, but it's eros, it is libido. It's like it stands in that's what I meant when, facing like that reference to Persephone, this idea of standing in the face of death, but not being just life, it's just bringing them together. Anyway, I just want to say thank you.
Can I just say something very quick? Thank you again for saying what I wanted to say in a much better way. The part of the bodily thing is also this might not be relevant or be relevant, but I'm someone who somatizes trauma, stress, and I'm also now sick. So I think there is something, and I talk to others. It's not about me or sickness or the body that is affected. When I talk to others around me, it's not that the bodies are subjected to something. It's that the bodies are feeling something. I think there is a difference. The bodies are not the object of an act. My body or the bodies on the street or the body politique or all of those bodies in Iran cities. It's that these are bodies that, let me put it this way, and when I talked about generations, these are bodies that are not built from fear. Their bones are not built with fear. Their parents' generation they had a lot of fear in their bones. And I think something inspiring and I find myself going through envy, hope, fear. I don't want to get hopeful again, but then, awe. They're teaching us something. So there is that. Anyway, thank you.
So, Michael,
sure.
Welcome to this conversation. Just because this is the first session, to say that Michael Fischer is professor at MIT and has spent much of in a way, the first half of his career working in Iran, and is the co-organizer of this seminar. And so, welcome.
Thanks, Byron. Thank you, Sadeh, for really an extraordinary presentation. The book is wonderful, but hearing articulate, I'm hearing an echo. Is that just me? Hearing you articulate it verbally, and here Orchidea is absolutely right, is a visceral experience as well. And it was just exquisitely done.